The blight died across Sanctuary Prime over the following week, its corruption crumbling into harmless, organic matter that Velith cleaning crews swept away with something approaching joy, crystal. Towers that had wept with contamination now stood, clean against pale skies that no longer carried the threat of toxic spores drifting on winds that had once meant certain death. Captain Park Jinho recovered faster than Velith medical science predicted possible, his human biology repairing damage that should have required months of treatment in a matter of days. Dr. Isao Mairei took longer due to her extended exhaustion before the final mission, but she spent her recovery time teaching Velith scientists how to maintain the biological countermeasures. The humans asked for nothing in payment, refusing all offers of compensation with genuine confusion that suggested they truly did not understand why anyone would expect reward for helping others. Administrator Yuna struggled with this reality that contradicted everything she understood about economics and social obligation and the fundamental rules that governed interactions between species. She visited Captain Park in the medical bay 3 days after the infection hard fell, finding him sitting up and reading reports about the colony's recovery progress with evident satisfaction. Your people heal remarkably quickly, Yuna observed while taking a seat beside his bed, no longer maintaining the careful distance she had kept during their first meeting. Deathworld biology has its advantages, Captain Park replied with a smile that transformed his alien features into something warm and approachable. Despite everything she knew about his species, our immune systems treat most injuries as minor inconveniences requiring quick repair so we can continue functioning in environments that actively try to kill us every moment of every day. I have been trying to understand your motivations, Yuna admitted, because the question had consumed her thoughts since watching these strangers sacrifice themselves for her people without hesitation. The Galactic Concord operates on principles of mutual exchange, where assistance requires compensation and obligations balanced precisely between parties involved in any transaction. You gave us everything and asked for nothing, and my people do not have frameworks to process this kind of interaction that ignores all established rules of civilized engagement. Captain Park was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered how to explain something that seemed so obvious to humans but so alien to species from gentler worlds on Earth. Our ancestors faced constant threats that no individual or family could survive alone, he began, his voice carrying the weight of evolutionary history spanning millions of years. Predators hunted us, diseases ravaged our communities, natural disasters destroyed everything we built, and the only way to survive was cooperation that extended beyond immediate self-interest. We learned that helping strangers today meant someone might help us tomorrow, but more importantly, it meant being the kind of creatures who deserved to survive in the first place. Yuna listened and felt something shifting in her understanding of the universe and the diverse forms that intelligence and civilization could take across the vast reaches of space. Your world taught you compassion through cruelty, she said slowly, testing this new concept against everything she had learned in her long career as a leader among her peaceful people. The violence of your environment created beings who value cooperation and sacrifice, precisely because you understand how precious and fragile life truly is when survival cannot be assumed. Something like that. Captain Park agreed with a nod that suggested she had grasped something important about human nature that most species never bothered to explore or understand. Young Bora arrived at the medical bay entrance and hesitated when she saw Administrator Yuna already present, uncertain whether to interrupt the conversation between leaders. Captain Park waved her in with an easy gesture that reflected none of the formality other species would expect when addressing someone who had saved their entire civilization from extinction. Bora has questions, Yuna explained, because the young liaison had shared her confusion and curiosity with the administrator during their many conversations about the impossible humans. I wanted to understand something before you leave, Bora said quietly, approaching the bed with caution that had become habit during her time working closely with the Deathworld team. You risked everything for people who feared you and expected the worst from your kind. And I need to know why humans choose to be this way when the galaxy gives you so many reasons not to care. Captain Park looked at her with eyes that held depths of experience and pain and hard-won wisdom that seemed impossible in someone who appeared so young by human standards, because the point of surviving our Deathworld was never just survival itself, he answered carefully, choosing words that might bridge the gap between such different ways of experiencing existence. Earth taught us that strength means nothing if you only use it to protect yourself, and endurance means nothing if you only endure for your own sake, without purpose beyond continuing to breathe. The real lesson of our homeworld was that life is precious precisely because it is so easily destroyed. And beings who understand this have an obligation to protect life wherever they find it struggling. Bora absorbed these words and felt them settle into her mind like seeds that might grow into something new if she tended them carefully over the coming years. Will you return if we need help again? She asked, because the thought of facing another crisis without humans available seemed almost unbearable after witnessing what they could accomplish. Someone will come, Captain Park promised with certainty that left no room for doubt in his voice or expression. The absolute conviction of someone stating simple truth. Humans spread across the stars not to conquer or exploit, but to find others who might need what we can offer. The strength we gained from our Deathworld and the compassion we learn from our suffering. When help is called, humans will always answer, because that is who we chose to become when we finally escaped the world that forged us into what we are today. The stalwart departed 3 weeks later, leaving behind a colony that would never forget what the humans had done or the lessons their sacrifice had taught about the nature of true civilization. Administrator Yuna ordered the story, recorded in permanent crystal archives that would survive for millennia, ensuring that future generations would know what happened when Deathworlders came to Sanctuary Prime. She shared the account across Galactic Concord communication networks, and the story spread to species who had never encountered humans directly, but now understood something important about them. The humans from Earth were not monsters despite their terrifying homeworld. Or perhaps they were monsters who had chosen to turn their monstrous capabilities toward protecting the vulnerable instead of preying upon them. Other species began seeking human assistance when crises struck their worlds, and the humans came every time with the same willingness to sacrifice that Captain Park and his crew had demonstrated. A new understanding spread through the galaxy about what it meant to be civilized, challenging assumptions that had governed interspecies relations since the first peaceful contacts were established long ago. Strength was not measured by what you could survive or what you could destroy, but by what you chose to protect when the universe gave you power that others lacked. And compassion was not weakness, but the highest expression of evolutionary success. The recognition that individual survival meant nothing without a purpose that transcended the boundaries of self-interest. Young Bora eventually became a leader among her people, and she built her administration on principles learned from watching humans dig through rubble to save a friend who told them to leave him behind. She taught her children and her people that help should be given freely to those who needed it, not because obligation demanded payment, but because helping others was its own reward. And when other species faced destruction and called out for assistance, The Velith answered alongside the humans, having learned from the best teachers the galaxy had ever produced. The monsters from the Deathworld had shown the cosmos what true strength looked like, and the galaxy was forever changed by the lesson they taught through sacrifice and compassion. When help was called, someone would always come, because that was the legacy the humans left behind wherever they traveled among the stars, and it was a legacy worth carrying forward into whatever future the galaxy might hold for all the diverse species who had learned to see humans not as threats, but as friends and protectors. The Deathworld had forged them in fire and pain and endless struggle against forces that should have destroyed them countless times throughout their evolutionary history on that nightmare planet. But they had emerged from that crucible with something precious: the understanding that survival meant nothing without purpose, and power meant nothing without compassion to guide its use. This was the gift they gave to every species they encountered. Not technology or weapons or resources, but the simple truth that being strong enough to help others carried with it the obligation to do so. And so the story of Sanctuary Prime became a legend, told and retold across 1,000 worlds to species who had never known what Deathworlders truly were until they heard about the humans who came when called. The counteragent sat in its containment vessel, a small amount of liquid that represented hope for an entire civilization and the tireless work of a woman who had not slept in over 50 hours. Dr. Seo Myray examined the readings one final time and confirmed what she had suspected since completing her analysis of the samples retrieved from the contaminated zone. The counteragent would work, but only if applied directly at the heart of the infection, where the original blight organism had established its primary growth and distribution network. Remote delivery was impossible because the blight had developed a primitive defense response that neutralized any foreign substances before they could reach the critical infection nodes deep within. Someone would have to carry the counteragent into the source zone and apply it by hand at precise locations that Dr. Seo had mapped based on the sample analysis and growth patterns. The source zone was worse than anything the humans had yet faced, with spore concentrations so high that even human resistance would fail within hours rather than the days there. Biology normally allowed Captain Park Jin-ho listen to the briefing with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts to the Velith officials gathered in the command center. Administrator Yuna watched him and recognized the calculations happening behind his calm exterior, weighing risks against responsibilities in a way she was beginning to understand about human leadership. "I will go," Captain Park announced when Dr. Seo finished her explanation of the requirements and the dangers that awaited anyone who entered the source zone without adequate protection. "Captain, the exposure levels exceed safe parameters even for human physiology," objected Medical Officer Shin Yejin, who had been treating the team members already affected by their earlier contaminated zone operations. "I am aware of the risks," Captain Park replied with a tone that ended debate before it could begin, the voice of someone who had already made peace with his decision. "I will need Dr. Seo to accompany me for precise application of the counteragent, but I am open to alternative suggestions if anyone has a plan that does not require human presence in the source zone." The silence that followed confirmed what everyone already knew. There was no alternative that offered any realistic chance of success against the blight-consuming Sanctuary Prime. Administrator Yuna stepped forward, and her voice cracked with emotion that she did not try to hide from the assembly of humans and Velith who watched this moment unfold. "Captain Park, I did not ask you to die for my people when I accepted your offer of assistance, and I cannot allow this sacrifice when you owe us nothing." "You asked for help," Captain Park replied gently, meeting her eyes with warmth that seemed impossible from a Deathworlder facing near certain death in an alien hellscape. This is what help looks like. Administrator, the willingness to do what needs to be done regardless of personal cost. Because something more important than individual survival hangs in the balance. Dr. Izio had already begun preparing her equipment for the journey, her movements showing no hesitation despite the same exhaustion that had plagued her since their arrival. I have prepared additional protective measures and stimulant treatments that should extend our functional time in the source zone, she reported while organizing supplies into a portable container. We will have approximately 3 hours to reach the infection heart, apply the counteragent at all required nodes, and return to safe zones before systemic failure begins affecting our performance. Yuna wanted to protest further, but recognized the futility of arguing with beings who had already decided to sacrifice themselves for strangers they had known for less than 3 days. Instead, she ordered every possible support measure activated, clearing paths, providing real-time mapping data, and positioning medical teams at the quarantine boundary for immediate treatment. Upon return, the journey began at dawn when the blight activity was lowest according to observations gathered since the outbreak started weeks ago and spread across the agricultural districts. Captain Park led the way with Dr. Asio close behind, both wearing the heaviest protective gear available and carrying enough supplies for emergencies that they hoped would not occur. The source zone lived up to its terrible reputation from the first moment they crossed the final safety barrier and entered territory that Velith had survived visiting since contamination began. Fungal growth covered everything in layers that pulsed with sickly bioluminescence, and the air itself seemed thick with malevolent intent. Despite the scientific impossibility of such a thing, spores attacked their suits immediately, seeking any weakness in the protective layers that stood between human biology and the corrosive organisms, engineered by random evolution to consume everything. Captain Park cleared a path with tools designed for exactly this purpose, cutting through organic barriers, while Dr. Esio monitored their exposure levels and adjusted their route accordingly. They spoke to each other constantly, not about the mission but about their lives, and the people waiting for them back on Earth. And aboard the stalwart in orbit above, Dr. Seo talked about her daughter who was studying medicine at a university in Seoul, following her mother's path toward helping others through scientific understanding of biological systems. Captain Park shared stories about his husband who worried constantly about these dangerous missions, but never asked him to stop, because he understood why the work mattered so much. He knows that being a good person means doing hard things sometimes. Captain Park explained while forcing open a sealed door that had fused shut with corrupted crystal growth. And he loves me for who I am, not who he wishes I would become if I abandoned everything I believe in to stay safe at home while others suffer needlessly. The infection heart waited for them at the center of the agricultural district, a massive organic structure that had consumed an entire processing facility and converted it into a distribution hub. It pulsed with terrible life, pumping spores through channels that spread across kilometers of colony infrastructure and converted everything they touched into more of the same corruption. Dr. CO studied the formation and identified the precise nodes where counteragent application would trigger cascading failure throughout the entire blight network across Sanctuary Prime. 7 injection points, she reported while preparing the delivery system with hands that shook from exhaustion and the fever already building in her bloodstream from toxic exposure. We need to hit them in sequence within a 10-minute window for maximum effect. Starting with the primary node at the center, and working outward to the distribution channels. Captain Park nodded and took position to defend her while she worked, crushing the defensive growths that emerged from the main structure whenever they sensed foreign presence nearby. The Blight fought back with everything it had developed during weeks of unopposed growth, throwing toxic masses and corrosive sprays at the invaders who threatened its existence. Captain Park absorbed punishment that would have killed any other being in the galaxy, his suit degrading and his body taking damage that he ignored through sheer force of stubborn human will. Dr. Isio applied the counteragent with surgical precision despite the chaos around her, hitting each node exactly as her analysis predicted while the structures screamed chemically in response. The seventh and final injection went in just as Captain Park's legs buckled from accumulated damage, and he caught himself on a support beam while Dr. Seo finished her work. "It is done," she gasped. Watching the readings on her equipment confirmed that the counteragent was spreading through the Blight's distribution network exactly as designed and modeled. The infection heart began dying around them, organic structures collapsing as the counteragent destroyed the cellular bonds that held the Blight together throughout its extended network. They ran through the failing nightmare landscape, dodging falling debris and collapsing tunnels, while the Blight thrashed in its death throws around and above them on all sides. Captain Park carried Dr. Seo when her legs gave out from exhaustion and exposure effects, pushing through barriers that should have stopped him based on everything they knew about human limits. They emerged from the quarantine zone just as the last major structure behind them collapsed into a pile of dead organic matter that would never threaten anyone again. Medical teams swarmed them immediately, pulling them toward treatment stations while Velith watched in stunned silence at what these Deathworlders had endured for the sake of strangers. Both humans collapsed the moment they knew they were safe, their bodies finally surrendering to damage that would require weeks of recovery and careful medical attention. But they were smiling as consciousness faded, because the Blight was dying across all of Sanctuary Prime, and everyone they had come to save would survive because of what they had done. Administrator Yuna stood over their unconscious forms and wept, crystal tears that caught the light of a sunrise that suddenly seemed full of promise instead of despair. Engineer Quan Suji checked her equipment one final time before leading her team through the last clean airlock and into the nightmare landscape that had once been the pride of Velith. Agriculture. The contaminated zone stretched before them like something from the fever dreams of a dying mind. All twisted organic growth and dripping corruption that pulsed with alien malevolence in the dim light. Crystalline structures that had stood elegant and pure for centuries now wept with fungal matter that consumed them slowly from within, dissolving the silicon bonds that held them together. The air churned with visible spores that swirled in patterns suggesting intelligence. Though Dr. Seo had assured them the Blight was merely responding to chemical gradients rather than actual thought, Suji moved forward with 3 team members behind her. Communication Specialist Moon Yoonji, Sample Collector Yoon Se-yoon, and Safety Officer Baek Ji-won, all experienced with hazardous environment operations. Their suits were rated for conditions far worse than this, but the Blight had proven capable of surprises that exceeded initial projections more than once since. The outbreak began. Young Boro watched from the safe zone through a drone that followed the human team at a careful distance, broadcasting everything back to the colony command center for observation. She had volunteered for this duty despite the obvious emotional strain of watching beings walk into conditions that would kill her within seconds of exposure to the contaminated atmosphere. The humans moved with confidence that seemed almost insulting to the danger surrounding them on all sides, stepping over corrupted growths and ducking under drooping organic masses without hesitation. Radiation levels increasing as expected, Ji-won reported, her voice calm despite readings that would have caused immediate evacuation orders for any other species attempting this mission. We have approximately 4 hours before cumulative exposure becomes a health concern, requiring medical intervention upon return to safe zones. Suji acknowledged with a gesture and continued forward, following the mapped route toward the original infection site where the blight had first taken root in Velith soil. The journey required constant attention as conditions changed around them with every passing minute of penetration into increasingly contaminated territory without any safe paths. Remaining walls collapsed without warning as their structural integrity finally failed after weeks of slow consumption by the relentless fungal organism that recognized no boundary or limitation. The team adapted and found new routes, their bodies and minds working together with the efficiency that only humans possessed after millions of years of evolutionary pressure. Bora watched through her drone feed and found herself unable to look away from these impossible beings who treated certain death like a minor inconvenience requiring slight adjustments. She activated her communication link and spoke to Suji directly, her voice carrying the confusion that had plagued her since the humans arrived on Sanctuary Prime. "Why you do this?" Bora asked as Suji squeezed through a gap between two corrupted columns that scraped against her suit and left trails of toxic residue on the material. "Why risk your lives for people you do not know and will likely never see again after you leave this place that means nothing to you or your species?" Suji paused on the other side and considered the question while her team members caught up and prepared for the next section of their hazardous journey through the contaminated landscape. "Because we can," Suji answered simply, as if this explained everything that needed explaining about human motivations and values in dangerous situations far from home. "I do not understand," Bora admitted, because on her world resources were precious and energy was conserved and nobody wasted anything on strangers who offered no return on investment. "Your people have helped us," Suji elaborated while checking her equipment and preparing to move again through the increasingly hostile environment that surrounded them completely. "Not you specifically, but other species have shared technology and knowledge with humanity since we first reached the stars 2 centuries ago and began learning about the greater galaxy. We pay that forward now, helping others when we can, because that is how civilization should work if they want to survive long enough to matter in the grand scheme of things." Bora considered this perspective that seemed so foreign to Velith, thinking about economics and social obligations that govern all interactions between individuals and groups. A sudden crash interrupted her thoughts as a section of ceiling collapsed directly onto team member Yoon Se-jun, burying him under corrupted debris that would have killed a Velith instantly. The other humans reacted with speed that defied belief, tearing at the rubble with their hands while calling out to their fallen comrade in voices that mixed concern. With fierce determination, Se-jun responded from beneath the pile, his voice strained but alive, as he reported that his suit remained intact but his leg was pinned by something heavy and possibly broken. "Leave me and continue the mission," Se-jun ordered with a tone that suggested he expected this command to be followed immediately without any argument or delay from his teammates. "Shut up," Suji replied flatly while digging with bleeding gloves that tore against the sharp edges of corrupted crystal that surrounded their injured friend all sides. Bora watched in absolute amazement as the humans refused to abandon their teammate. Despite the mission priority and the limited time available before radiation exposure became critical for everyone, they dug with hands that must have hurt terribly, ignoring the pain and the danger and the logical calculations that would have governed Velith decision-making in similar circumstances. 20 minutes later, they pulled Se-jun free from the debris and examined his leg, which bent at an angle that even Bora could recognize as unnatural and requiring immediate medical attention. "I can continue," Se-jun insisted, already attempting to stand on his damaged limb with a grimace that suggested the pain was far worse than his casual tone implied to his friends. "No," Suji commanded with authority that left no room for argument even from someone clearly determined to push through any obstacle regardless of personal cost to themselves. Yoonji will escort you back to the safe zone while Ji-won and I complete the sample collection. And you will not argue, because that is an order from your team leader. Sejong protested, but ultimately obeyed, leaning on Eunji as they began the long journey back through territory they had already crossed once in better circumstances. Bora found her voice again and asked another question that burned in her mind after witnessing the humans risk everything to save a single team member from the rubble. You delayed your mission and endangered everyone to save one person who told you to leave him behind. And I need to understand why you made that choice. Suji looked directly at the drone camera, and her expression showed something Bora had no words to describe. Something that seemed to mix love and fierce protectiveness and absolute refusal. Because that is what we do. Suji said simply before turning and continuing toward the original infection site, with Ji-won following close behind her through the corrupted landscape. Humans do not leave each other behind. Not ever. Not for any reason that makes logical sense to species who calculate the value of lives against mission objectives and resource costs. Back in the command center, Dr. SEO worked without rest to prepare everything needed for counteragent development. Once the samples arrived from the contaminated zone, Administrator Yuna approached her and noticed the dark circles under the human's eyes and the slight tremor in her hands that suggested exhaustion beyond what Velith bodies could endure. When did you last sleep? Yuna asked with concern that surprised her, caring about the well-being of a Deathworlder who should have inspired only caution and careful distance. 37 hours ago, Dr. Asio replied without looking up from her work, her focus absolute. Despite the obvious toll that extended wakefulness was taking on her body and mind. Is this normal for your species? Yuna asked, horrified by the idea of remaining conscious for so long without the restorative rest at all. Velith required every 12 hours. Dr. Seo smiled slightly and finally met Yuna's eyes with an expression that mixed exhaustion with something that looked almost like pride in her species' capabilities. Humans evolved as persistence predators on Earth, running prey to exhaustion over days when necessary to secure food for our families and communities. She explained calmly, "We do not like it, but we can function without sleep for extended periods when the situation demands, and right now, your people need this counteragent more than I need rest." A communication alert interrupted them with news that Suji and Ji-won had reached the infection site and were beginning sample collection. Despite worsening conditions in the deepest contaminated zone, Dr. Seo straightened and prepared her equipment, ready to begin work the moment those samples arrived. Regardless of how many hours she had already spent awake, and Yuna watched her with new understanding of what it truly meant to be human, to carry the legacy of a Deathworld not as a burden, but as a gift to be shared with those in need. The human shuttle descended through the pale atmosphere of Sanctuary Prime, with a grace that seemed impossible for something built by Deathworlders who came from a realm of violence and chaos. Administrator Yuna stood at the landing platform with her council behind her, all of them wearing protective masks and maintaining the maximum safe distance recommended by their own medical advisors. She had studied everything available about humans during the 14 hours before their arrival, and the information had done nothing to calm her racing hearts or settle her trembling hands. Humans could survive temperature ranges that would flash freeze or cook most galactic species within seconds of exposure to such extreme conditions without any protection. They healed from wounds that would kill other beings, their bodies containing repair mechanisms refined over billions of years of constant damage and recovery on their hostile homeworld. They required sleep, but could function without it for days when necessary, pushing through exhaustion that would shut down the nervous systems of more sensible creatures entirely, and perhaps most terrifying of all, They formed emotional bonds with almost anything, including organisms that wanted to kill them and eat their remains afterward. The shuttle touched down with barely a whisper of displaced air, and the landing ramp lowered slowly while Yuna fought the urge to retreat to the safety of the nearest sealed building. The first human emerged wearing a full environmental suit that covered every centimeter of skin. And this small consideration surprised Yuna more than anything she had read in her research. She had expected conquering predators who would ignore the safety of weaker beings, but instead she witnessed careful respect for Veleth vulnerability. From these supposed monsters of the cosmos, more humans followed in similar protective gear, carrying equipment cases and moving with efficient purpose that spoke of training and experience with emergency response situations. The lead human approached and stopped at a respectful distance before removing only the helmet portion of the kivas de suit to reveal a face that seemed surprisingly gentle to Veleth eyes. Administrator Yuna, I am Captain Park Jinho of the Stalwart, and we are honored that you have trusted us to assist your people during this crisis. He spoke in fluent Veleth with only a slight accent. Captain Park, Yuna replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. Despite the strangeness of addressing a living Deathworlder who stood close enough to reach out and touch her if he wished, we are grateful for your swift response to our distress signal. Though I admit we have concerns about the risks your presence may pose to our population already weakened by this blight. Completely understandable. Captain Park said with a small nod of his head that seemed to convey respect without any trace of offense at her honest statement of worry. We will maintain full isolation protocols throughout our operation here, and our medical officer has prepared specialized measures to ensure no Terran microorganisms escape our containment systems. He gestured toward another suited figure who stepped forward and bowed slightly in a gesture that the Veleth recognized as a human sign of respect and peaceful intentions. This is Dr. Sayo Myre, our chief xenobiologist and the leader of our scientific response team that will analyze your blight and develop countermeasures against it. Dr. Aseo spoke through her suit's communication system, her voice gentle in a way that seemed strange. Coming from a being evolved on the most dangerous planet in known space, Administrator, I would like to examine samples of the infected material as soon as possible so we can begin developing a response before the blight spreads further into uncontaminated zones. Yuna found herself nodding despite her lingering fears, because the humans radiated a calm competence that suggested they truly believed this problem could be solved with sufficient effort. She assigned her assistant, Bora, to serve as liaison for the human team, a young Veleth who had volunteered despite the obvious dangers of close contact with Deathworld organisms over the following hours. Yuna observed the humans at work and found her preconceptions challenged by every interaction she witnessed between them and her frightened people. They moved differently than any species Yuna had encountered before, with a fluid efficiency that suggested constant awareness of their surroundings and readiness for sudden threats from any direction. But they modulated their movements around the Veleth, slowing down and telegraphing their actions to avoid startling the delicate beings who flinched at sudden gestures or unexpected sounds. When a support beam in the quarantine processing area cracked and began falling toward a group of Veleth technicians who stood frozen in terror below it, everything changed in an instant. A human named Cho Tai-Yang moved faster than Yuna's eyes could track, crossing the distance and catching the beam with his bare hands through his suit gloves before it could crush anyone. He held it there, muscles straining against weight that should have been impossible for any single organism to support without mechanical assistance or structural support of some kind. Other humans quickly braced the beam with emergency supports, while Cho Tai-Yang called out for the Veleth to evacuate the area with voices that remained calm despite the obvious danger when it was over. Cho Tai-Yang laughed and flexed his hands as if testing for damage, then commented to his fellow humans that the beam had been lighter than he expected. Yuna heard this and felt something shift in her understanding of what humans truly were and what their Deathworld origins meant for those who survived such a crucible of evolution. Dr. SEO completed her initial analysis within 6 hours, a speed that Vela scientists said should have been impossible without weeks of careful study and multiple verification processes. She gathered Yuna's counsel and explained her findings with the same gentle patience she showed in every interaction with beings who clearly feared her very existence. The fungal organism is aggressive, but relatively simple in its structure and attack mechanisms compared to many Terran pathogens I have studied throughout my career. Dr. Seo reported, it resembles several species from Earth's tropical regions, and I believe we can develop a counteragent using modified Terran microorganisms that will target and destroy the blight without harming Velith biology. Hope flickered in Yuna's hearts for the first time since the contamination had been discovered. But Dr. Seo's expression suggested complications remained to be addressed before victory could be achieved. The challenge is that we need samples from the original infection site deep in the agricultural district, where the blight concentration is highest and most dangerous to any living being. Our drones cannot penetrate those areas, Science Director Hanil said with despair returning to his voice as he recalled the many failed attempts to gather information from the contaminated zones. The spore concentration destroys their systems within minutes, and the radiation from damaged power cores adds another lethal factor that prevents any approach by Velith personnel or equipment. Dr. Seo nodded and looked toward Captain Park, who met her gaze with an expression that seemed to communicate entire conversations in a single glance. Between experienced partners, the radiation and toxin levels in those zones would kill any Velith within minutes of exposure. Captain Park acknowledged while the council members lowered their heads in renewed hopelessness. But humans can survive significantly higher levels of both factors for extended periods. Long enough to retrieve the samples, Dr. Seo needs to complete her counteragent development process. Yuna stared at him with disbelief that these beings would volunteer to enter conditions that would mean certain death for her own people without any hesitation or demand for compensation. You would risk your lives entering those contaminated zones just to help strangers you met only hours ago? She asked. Unable to comprehend the reasoning behind such apparent madness, Captain Park smiled, and the expression transformed his face into something almost warm despite the alienness of his Deathworld features that should have inspired only fear and caution. Administrator, where we come from, this kind of situation is just another problem to be solved with the right tools and sufficient determination to see the task through to completion. He turned to his crew members who had gathered nearby, and Yuna saw eager expressions on their faces as if they welcomed the chance to face danger that would kill anyone else instantly. To humans, this is just another Tuesday. The crystal towers of Sanctuary Prime had stood for 3,000 years without a single crack, but now they wept with corruption and decay that no Velith had ever witnessed before in their long, peaceful history. Administrator Yuna pressed her thin fingers against the observation window and watched another agricultural dome collapse in the distance, sending plumes of toxic spores into the pale morning sky that had once been so clean and pure. The blight had arrived 6 weeks ago on a routine trader vessel from the outer systems, hidden in a cargo container of organic fertilizer that the Velith had purchased to enrich their crystalline food crops for better growth. At first it seemed like nothing more than a minor contamination that their cleaning systems would handle within a few days of standard treatment and careful monitoring. But the fungal organism adapted faster than anything in Velith recorded history, learning to consume not just organic matter, but the silicon-based structures that formed the very bones of their civilization and homes. Now half the colony lay under quarantine, and the other half watched the corruption spread closer every single hour despite everything they tried to stop it. Yuna turned away from the window and faced her council of advisors, who sat in rigid silence around the curved meeting table with fear written clearly on their delicate features. The latest projections show complete colony failure within 40 days, announced Science Director Haniel, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had accepted inevitable doom without any remaining hope. The Galactic Concord has responded to our distress signals, Yuna said, though her words carried no comfort or relief for anyone present in the chamber. What do they offer us? Asked Defense Coordinator Minho, though his posture suggested he already knew. The answer would bring no salvation to their dying world. Sympathy and logistic support for evacuation, Yuna replied. And the council members lowered their heads in despair at hearing what they had feared most. The Velith were not a species built for crisis or survival against aggressive threats from hostile organisms. And everyone in the room understood this fundamental truth about their kind. They had evolved on a gentle moon with stable temperatures, predictable weather patterns, and an ecosystem so balanced that disease was nearly unknown among all living things there. Their bodies were elegant but fragile, designed for a world that never challenged them with violence or pestilence or any form of aggressive competition for survival. The galaxy held many such species, creatures from garden worlds who had risen to intelligence without ever needing to fight against nature itself just to exist another day. And the Galactic Concord was built primarily by such species, who understood cooperation and trade, but had little experience with biological warfare against invisible enemies. There must be someone who can help us, whispered Agricultural Director Jisoo, her crystalline eyes reflecting the distant fires where infected structures were being burned in desperate attempts at containment. Yuna had sent requests to every member species within communication range, but the responses all carried the same apologetic helplessness that offered nothing real. The Torith had advanced medical technology, but no experience with aggressive pathogens since their world had sterilized itself naturally millions of years before they evolved. The Kessni offered financial support for relocation, but admitted their own vulnerability to biological threats would prevent them from sending any personnel to help directly. The Mendari simply did not respond at all, having sealed their borders against any potential contamination the moment they heard about the outbreak on Sanctuary Prime. Administrator, we have received one more response, announced Communications Officer Dayan from her station at the far end of the chamber, her voice carrying an uncertain quality. From whom? Yuna asked, though she expected nothing useful from yet another species offering thoughts and prayers instead of actual assistance. A human vessel called the Stalwart, currently passing through the Vern system approximately 14 hours from our position at standard travel speed, Dayan reported while studying her display. The council chamber fell into absolute silence that seemed to freeze the very air itself, and Yuna felt her heart beating faster with a mixture of emotions she could not name. Humans were known throughout the galaxy, though few species had direct contact with them due to their relatively recent emergence onto the galactic stage. Just 2 centuries ago, they came from Earth, a world that other species spoke of in whispered tones, usually reserved for cosmic disasters and ancient horrors that lurked between the stars. A Deathworld of the highest classification, where the very environment seemed designed by some cruel intelligence to test the limits of biological survival every single moment. The planet suffered constant tectonic violence, extreme weather patterns, temperature variations that would kill most species within hours, and radiation levels that damaged genetic material continuously. Worse still, Earth teemed with predators, parasites, and pathogens engaged in an endless war of evolution that had lasted for billions of years without pause or mercy. The humans had not merely survived this nightmare. They had conquered it and spread across their world like a force of nature that could not be stopped by anything. Now they traveled the stars, carrying within their bodies the legacy of their Deathworld origins that made other species nervous just being in the same room with them. What do they offer? Minho asked, and his voice carried the edge of someone who feared the answer might be worse than the problem they currently faced. Their captain offers immediate assistance with biological containment and elimination of the pathogen. Dayon read from the message, her tone reflecting her own uncertainty about this development. They claim to have experience with aggressive fungal organisms and believe they can develop a counteragent within days of arrival and initial assessment of our situation here. Yuna exchanged glances with her council members and saw the same conflict reflected in every face around the table as they weighed impossible choices. Inviting Deathworlders to their vulnerable colony seemed like madness, like opening the door to predators while fleeing from a fire that might still be controlled somehow. The humans carried microorganisms in their bodies that could potentially devastate Velith biology even more thoroughly than the blight currently consuming their world. But blight was not a potential threat. It was a certain death sentence that grew closer with every hour they spent debating and waiting for better options. How many humans crew this vessel? Yuna asked, her mind already calculating risks and contingencies, even as her instincts screamed warnings about this dangerous path. 47 crew members, including medical and scientific personnel, equipped for xenobiological research and emergency response situations according to their vessel registration records. Dan answered promptly. They await our response and state they will alter course immediately upon receiving authorization to approach and render assistance to our colony. Yuna stood at the window again and watched another tower begin to lean as the blight consumed its foundation. Knowing the tower would fall before nightfall and wondering how many more would follow, she thought about her people. About 3,000 years of peaceful civilization built on this quiet moon. About children who had never known fear or danger in their entire lives. And she thought about monsters from a nightmare world. Creatures forged in an evolutionary furnace that produced beings capable of surviving anything the universe could throw at them. Send authorization for approach, Yuna commanded. And she heard several council members gasp at her decision that would change everything for better or worse. Tell them we welcome any assistance they can provide and will prepare quarantine protocols for their arrival, according to whatever specifications they require for safe interaction. The message went out across the void, and 14 hours later, the stalwart entered orbit around Sanctuary Prime like a messenger from some realm where survival was not a gift, but a battle won daily. Yuna watched the shuttle bay doors open on the vessel's belly, and she prepared herself to meet the monsters who might be their only hope of salvation. The humans were coming, and nothing would ever be the same again.